welcome. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Children of the Sun radio show and podcast. A wide-ranging exploration of positive energy from a fifth-dimensional metaphysical point of view, broadcast from the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea on WSTX AM 970, the soul of the Caribbean, on St. Croix every Friday afternoon at 12:30 Atlantic Standard Time. I'm your host, Ray Bratcher. I give sacred breathwork sessions here on St. Croix and around the world. And the purpose of this program is the same as the purpose of those breathwork sessions: to free your mind, heal your body, and live your life from the essential nature of your spirit, which is joy, love, and inner peace. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Children of the Sun radio show and podcast, a wide-ranging exploration of positive energy from a fifth-dimensional metaphysical point of view, broadcast from the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea on WSTX AM 970, the soul of the Caribbean, on St. Croix every Friday afternoon at 12:30 Atlantic Standard Time. I'm your host, Ray Bratcher. I give sacred breathwork sessions on St. Croix and around the world. And the purpose of this program is the same as the purpose of those breathwork sessions: to assist you to free your mind, heal your body, and live your life from the essential nature of your spirit, which is joy, love, and inner peace. So welcome to the program. Welcome to the weekend. Sit back, strap in, and let's do this. And welcome to the program. Welcome to Friday, October 11th, 2024. Here on WSTX AM 970, the soul of the Caribbean. Got an interesting program lined up for you today, I hope. You know, maybe you've heard of the great the great reset, the great awakening that is supposed to be happening now. Maybe you haven't heard of it in those terms, but you just have a sense, or you've heard people talking about how there's a global shift in consciousness and people are becoming more spiritually aware. Maybe you've had a sense of it in your own life. You feel like you or the people that you know seem to be more interested in spiritual topics or metaphysical topics or spirituality, not necessarily religion, but spirituality. Now, of course, when some people talk about the Great Reset or the Great Awakening, they mean more and more people becoming followers of QAnon, for example. And that's not what I mean. And that's not what most of the people talking about the shift in consciousness and the arising of a new spirituality mean. That's kind of that kind of conspiratorial thinking is actually the exact opposite of the spiritual awakening that's taking place on the planet today. And it's an effort to hijack it, actually. There basically are two thought systems that every human being has access to. The thought system of the ego, which is based on fear, separation, exclusivity, my group is better than your group, blame, resentment, judgment, victimhood. That's the thought system of the ego. And then there is the thought system of oneness, which is based in love, joy, expansion, inclusivity. And that conspiratorial QAnon stuff is hardcore ego. So that's not what I am talking about. That's not what most people mean by the spiritual awakening. And it is true that there is a spiritual awakening taking place in the world right now, a true spiritual awakening. I see it in my own work, in breath work. When I first started in giving breath work sessions to people decades ago, hardly anybody knew what it was or had heard of it. Nowadays, it's like one of the most Google Analytics. I read an article about this. I don't really know how to access that, but I read an article that said, according to Google Analytics, breathwork was the most frequent search term that Google processed last year. So lots of people are interested in breathwork. And lots of people are interested in other forms of spirituality as well. But there's a sense in which all of this spiritual activity remains an egoic activity. So there's sort of like a central problem with the human condition in that people feel a kind of sense of dissatisfaction. The Buddha said that human beings experience suffering, but a lot of scholars say that word, which is dukkha, which is normally the Sanskrit word dukkha, normally translated into English as suffering, actually would be more correctly translated as unsatisfactoriness. So, you don't have to be in like overt absolute suffering.
you're dying, or you just lost a loved one, or you just lost your job, like obvious examples of suffering, right? Things could be going fairly well for you. Job's okay, relationships are okay, no problems, electricity is working, internet's working, but you still have this unease, this kind of general sense of dissatisfaction. And people look for ways of addressing that. And obviously, when the dissatisfaction becomes serious suffering, then it's actually a blessing, because people tend to look more seriously for ways of addressing it. And today, with the world seen as problematic and frightening, frankly, challenging as it is, even if you aren't experiencing personal suffering, if you have any kind of empathy at all, any kind of social awareness or consciousness at all, you could probably, you're probably quite troubled by what's going on in the world today. And that can give rise to a desire on your part to search for a way out of the suffering caused by that anxiety, that feeling of trouble connected with the world's theme today. And probably for most of human history, 99.9% of human beings sought a relief of suffering, sought to deal with their anxieties about the future, sought to deal with that general sense of unsatisfactoriness that seems to be part and parcel of the human condition. They sought for a solution to that, for a remedy to that in the outer world, in the outside world, outside of consciousness, outside of your mind, in the outer world. So looking for solutions in a new car. I'll buy a new car, and that will make me feel better. That will give me a way of not feeling unsatisfactory anymore. Or a new job, or a new relationship, or a new house. In other words, people, for most of human history, the vast majority, I would say 99.9% of human beings, thought for or seek, because it's still very common today, seek to make themselves feel better by turning to things in the outside world. Oftentimes, this will take the form of getting someone else to change. If you could behave differently, I could be happy. If this situation could be different, I could be happy. Now, eventually, people realize that this doesn't work, that it never works. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons why. I mean, it's sort of common knowledge now. You get a new car, but the new car doesn't stay new forever. Eventually, it's just another car. So you could be happy at first, but then eventually you're back to square one, right where you started, unhappy again. You can only be happy if someone behaves the way that you need them to behave. Well, now they are in charge of your happiness, and you're never going to get them to behave the way that you want them to behave. So this idea of trying to heal this suffering, this sense of dissatisfaction by turning to things outside of us, never works. And eventually, everybody figures that out. I mean, some people figure it out in this lifetime, but the ones that figure it out in this lifetime might very well have spent thousands of lifetimes prior to this, stubbornly trying to make it work by turning to things in the outside world. But even the ones that figure it out in this lifetime, it usually takes more than a couple of tries before they realize, yeah, that's not going to work. So then what do? They go within. They turn to the inside. They go inside of consciousness. Instead of trying to make themselves feel better by working on something out there in the world, they try to make themselves feel better by going within and working on something in here, inside themselves. And then that's the beginning of the spiritual path. And that's what people mean when they talk about the Great Reset, the Great Awakening, the shift in consciousness. So instead of 99.9% of people seeking for the solution out in the world, now it's probably maybe 89% of people are seeking for the solutions out in the world. So that's good. That means 11% of people, instead of 0.1, now 11%, around 10% of humanity has given up on, realized the futility of finding solutions in the outside world, and they have entered a spiritual path. They're going within to find the end of suffering. So in that sense, more people are becoming spiritually awakened, or at least more people now have an interest in spiritual awakening. They're Googling breathwork. They're going to non-duality workshops. They show up for manifest your reality seminars. But it's not as rosy or as hopeful as the numbers would imply, because most of that 11% of people that are now looking for the end of suffering by going within are using that process, the spiritual path, the self-improvement path. They're using it the same way they used to use getting a new car or getting a new relationship or getting a new house, getting a new place to live, or getting somebody to behave the way you need them to behave so that you can be happy. They're using it in the same way. So it just becomes a substitute for the external efforts rather than a genuinely spiritual approach. And so what do I mean by that? The source of that suffering, that dissatisfactoriness, is really a deeply, deeply, deeply repressed fear in the deepest subterranean chambers of the human psyche. And everything that we do, for the most part, is to keep that fear nice and repressed and to distract our attention from it so that we don't have to face it, and to try to pretend like we don't know that it's there. It's kind of an activity of whistling past the graveyard. I like to compare it to if you were when you were a child, if you ever had the experience of being you're in your bedroom at night, you're supposed to be asleep, but you're wide awake, your heart pounding, and you're got your feet up on the middle of you're like sitting up in the bed because you are completely convinced there is a monster in your bedroom closet getting ready to come out. Well, so what in real life, what eventually happens is your parents discover you terrified and sweating in the middle of your bed, ask you what's wrong. You tell them there's a monster in the closet. They then open the closet door so that you can see there is no monster, and your fear is instantly evaporated, and everything's great. So that's what in real life in that situation tends to happen. But let's kind of take this as a metaphor for the deep repressed fear of the subterranean chambers of the human psyche. And let's go with that. Let's imagine that this bedroom closet is in the deep subterranean chambers of the human condition, of the human psyche. And you're convinced there's a monster in there. And the monster is pounding on the closet door trying to get out. And you know that what you should do. You should go open the closet door and face the monster. But you don't want to do that because it's too scary. So what you do instead is you whistle past the graveyard. You try to pretend like the closet isn't there. You try to pretend like you can't hear the monster banging on the door. You go upstairs, you go out of your house, you go to your new job in your new car and have lunch with your new relationship, all to distract you from the closet so you don't have to think about it. And over thousands of years, thousands of lifetimes, human beings have become very good at pretending like that closet isn't there, at pretending like they can't hear the monster banging on the door. But you know it's there, and it's eating you up alive from inside and filling you with trepidation and anxiety, which then manifests in the external environment because that consciousness creates a mirror for itself in your external world. So then inner unsatisfactoriness eventually becomes outer suffering. And we're constantly cycling back and forth between terrible suffering and typical ordinary life dissatisfaction. But all of it is generated by the monster in the closet and our efforts to try to pretend like that monster and closet do not exist. And so if you use spirituality the same way non-spiritual people use a new job or a new car or getting somebody in the outer world to act the way you need them to so that you can be happy. If you use spirituality in the same way, as a way of simply covering up the closet, covering up the monster, pretending like you don't know it's there, pretending like you can't hear it banging on the door, getting ready to break out. Then that's not the true spiritual path. That's using spirituality the same way the most non-spiritual people use outer things, circumstances, events. I mean, I see it in my own profession of breath work. People who use breath work, instead of using it to deal with the monster in the closet, they use it as an experience. They come to it for an ayahuasca type altered state of consciousness experience. Which is basically like using it as an entertaining movie that they can watch to distract themselves from thinking about the closet. Just like a non-spiritual person might watch Netflix to distract themselves from thinking about the closet. They aren't actually dealing with the monster. Other modalities, other approaches, spiritual approaches, have people do the same thing. All kinds of, like I say, it used to be that 99.9% of people would deal with the human problems by turning to the outside. Now maybe only 88% of people are only turning to the outside. And you've got 11% of people that are going inside. But of that 11%, how many are doing the real spiritual work of going inside, and how many are simply, the external path of new car, new job, new relationship didn't work. Let's try this internal stuff. But they're using it the same way. Like they're doing exactly the same thing they always did. But now they're doing it with spiritual stuff. Even some of our religions, people go to church, and it's kind of an entertaining and distracting, feel-good relationship with that particular religion, with Jesus or the Buddha or whatever. It's being used as a distraction from doing the real work. People get into non-duality, and it quickly becomes a very mental, conceptual thing. They have lots of ideas about what oneness is, lots of concepts. They even get advanced degrees in Hindu studies, Buddhist psychology, comparative religion. And they mistake that kind of mind candy, that kind of abstract conceptual thinking about spirituality, for the actual work of spirituality. The actual work is to deal with the monster in the closet. To face it and see what it is, see it for what it is, and to see through it. I started out at the beginning by talking about how every human being has two thought systems: the thought system of the ego based in fear. And so that fear is the monster in the closet. But if you can see through the fear and see the monster in the closet for what it is, then you have access to the thought system based on love. And that is the real work. That thought system based on fear gives rise to perception, which is always subject to interpretation. So it's constantly changing. When you can see through the fear and see the monster in the closet for what it is, that is spiritual vision. That is true seeing based on the certainty of knowledge, which is not subject to interpretation and therefore never changes. Not only is not constantly changing, but never changes. So this monster in the closet, in the deep subterranean caverns of the human psyche, and I'm talking about all of us. There's only one of us here. But we also have one fear-based collective ego, which breaks up into our own individual egos. You have the perception of having an individual Christ consciousness and an individual ego consciousness. But really, there's only one. So we share this common subterranean closet with the monster in it. And if you can see through it, see it for what it is, you are released from the fear-based thought system, and then automatically the love-based thought system takes over. It's already there, but we veil it, we cover it up with our fear-based thought system. The Course in Miracles introduction says that this course cannot teach love because that is beyond what can be taught, but it can teach you to remove the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. So true spiritual work is about removing the fear-based blocks. It's about opening the closet door and seeing that monster that fills us with fear for what it is, seeing through it, giving up in perception and all of its various interpretations in favor of love-based spiritual vision. And that those perceptions with their interpretations are where your idea of, enemies comes from. This person doesn't like me. This person is out to get me. This person was rude. This group of people is dangerous and must be controlled. It's where your fear-based perception in perceptual interpretations of your own lacks and limitations and failings come from. I'm not good enough. I can't do that. I don't know how to do math. I don't know how to be comfortable at parties. I have a hard time concentrating. I don't do well in school. All of these attacks on yourself based in lack and limitation are you perceiving yourself according to an interpretation based on fear, which starts with the fear of the monster in the closet. And there's all kinds of ways of using spirituality the same way non-spiritual people use outside world stuff. Instead of dealing with the monster in the closet, you use spirituality to distract yourself from the monster in the closet, to repress it more deeply, to like not have to think about it. Well, you know, I've been around this rebirthing breathwork since the late 90s. And I got my initial training with the guy who invented it and spent a lot of time at his training center with some of his earliest students, people who'd been doing breathwork for decades, were famous worldwide. And in that, you know, I guess social circle, in that environment, a lot of times the work of breath work was compared to peeling an onion. That a client lays down and they breathe. So one thing to understand, in case you, I mean, just a basic synopsis, a basic idea of how breath work works. Your breathing affects your state of consciousness, your emotional state, your mental state, your physiological state. When you are calm, you breathe one way. When you are nervous and upset or anxious, you breathe a completely different way. And what was discovered was if you copy the breathing of a particular state, you can become that state. So if you breathe the way a nervous, anxious person breathes, you will very quickly become nervous and anxious yourself, even if you weren't before you started breathing. And if you breathe the way a calm person is breathing, you will very quickly calm down. So instead of your state determines how you breathe, your breathing can determine what your state is. So that was just like that's probably common sense now. Back in the day, it was like radical, you know, new age holistic hocus pocus. Anyway, if you breathe the rebirthing breath as done by the person who invented it. Now, there's all kinds of offshoots now. Shamanic breathing, Wim Hof breathing, vibration, transformational. But the idea behind the original version was if you breathe the way someone who never had an upsetting event happen in their life, or if they did have an upsetting event, dealt with it right then and did not repress it, you will become like a person who never repressed anything, who never had any fear, who never had any troubles. But you have suppressed and repressed things through your life. So the two conditions cannot coexist. In other words, you are a perfect, unlimited being based in love. You have incorrectly taken upon yourself limitations from fear. This wasn't wrong or bad, it was a mistake. And that suppressed fear limits you. It kind of like circumscribes your potential. It interferes with your life. You are not able to be as good at life as you could be had that fake, false, erroneous, fear-based limitation not gotten installed into you, instilled into you, like programming, like conditioning, brainwashing. Often in early childhood, based on a child's misinterpretation of perfectly benign events. And you can't get it out because you don't know it's there. A lot of times this stuff happens to us in the womb and in the actual process of being born. There's a lot of trauma that takes place there. And in the early days of our life on Earth. It happens before we have words. So no amount of talking therapy can access it because it was put into you before you even had words. So there's nothing to talk about. It's sort of like a felt sense of fear and contraction and limitation, which you can access with breath work. If you breathe the way a person who never had any trauma, and if they did, processed it immediately on the spot, never repressed it. If you breathe like such a person, you will enter a state, like a calm state or a nervous, anxious state. You will enter the state of a person basically who's completely enlightened. And that fear, that repressed, early conditioned, installed fear in you cannot coexist with that state. So it tends to come up from repression and into your everyday consciousness as you're laying there breathing, which isn't exactly an everyday, you're just an altered state. But it comes up into your awareness as you are laying on the table doing the guided breathing. It comes up and you see it for what it is. You see through it. You see through the fear, and their perceptual interpretation becomes certain knowledge that it is meaningless, and you are freed from it. But you have more than one issue. Most people have lots of issues. So in the days of breath work, when I was, hanging along, starting out as a lowly gopher boy apprentice, learning how to breathe myself, then eventually sitting on other people's sessions, and eventually becoming lead trainer, and then eventually becoming executive director. This took place over a number of years. But when I was just hanging out with all these world famous breath workers, they would talk about it as like peeling an onion. So when somebody has their session and enters the state and some long repressed traumatic fear gets integrated and they're free of it, that's one layer of the onion. And now you can breathe again and go deeper and find something even more deeply repressed. And that's the second layer of the onion. And after a while, if you work on it long enough, you start to get into areas that for example, you might have a specific negative, like a fear of, this is what we would call it, a specific negative, a fear of public speaking. And that's a very concrete, specific thought, but it's controlled by a more abstract thought, a fear of other people in general, which is controlled by an even more abstract thought, I'm not safe. The more abstract a thought is, the more thoughts it controls. So if you can get abstract, so it's this abstract thought, I'm not safe, might control 5 or 6 less abstract thoughts. And those 5 or 6 less abstract thoughts might each of them control 5 or 6 specific negatives, very concrete thoughts. So when you develop the skill of doing the breath work and going really deep into the really higher order abstract thoughts, now you're peeling away the onion 6 or 7 or 10 layers at a time. So you make very rapid spiritual progress, very rapid personal improvement, self-improvement progress. And for most people, that's probably about as fast as you want to go, because you need to give your mind time to integrate changes. Going it much faster than that is going to be frightening to most people. It's too fast. But in those early days, with these world famous breath workers talking about peeling the onion, what I noticed was that a lot of them still had a ton of work to do. They had been peeling the onion for decades, and they still got triggered at the slightest thing. They still had very limiting thoughts. They still were coming out of a duality separation-based consciousness. And it was taught that we have these repressed fears beginning in the womb, and then all through birth, infancy, school trauma. And going by my own experience, as I got into this work, I began to realize that there was hardly a day that went by that I didn't have some kind of triggering thing come up. Not triggering. It would be the basis for what would later be a triggering thing. But I'm talking about when I would originally have this whatever. I get embarrassed at school. Instead of dealing with it, I pretend like it didn't happen and repress it. And 10 years later, I've forgotten all about it, but it's still there inside me, limiting me, holding me back. And I realized just in this one lifetime alone, I had hundreds of that stuff. So that's hundreds of layers. And if the experience of breath workers that past lives, reincarnation is a thing, is true, then we've got hundreds of onion layers from thousands of lives. So how long is it going to take to peel this onion one layer at a time. I started to become kind of, I don't know, just like, oh, it's got to be a better way. It's just nobody has this kind of time. So I started looking for a better way. And that's what led to me eventually being shown downloading Sacred Breath. Instead of peeling the onion one layer at a time, we just cut the tree of the ego at the root, one fell swoop. But it can be frightening. Facing the monster in the closet, now, spoiler alert, you have nothing to fear. The monster in the closet isn't there. You spent millions of years creating a false reality to hide out in, hiding from God, because you think God is out to get you, because you think you did something to God. And none of that is true. And that's what Jesus was trying to tell us when he reframed the story of the Garden of Eden with the story of the prodigal son. The Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve sin against God, and God throws them out of the garden, i.e., out of paradise, out of heaven. Jesus' reframing is the prodigal son story. Did the king throw the son out of the kingdom? No. The son asked to leave. The son came to the king and said, I want to leave. Give me my inheritance. I'm going to go out on my own. He wasn't thrown out. He wanted to leave. He left of his own free will. He left of his own accord. He left the kingdom. Again, a symbol for the same, just as in the Garden of Eden story, the Garden of Eden paradise is a symbol for heaven. The kingdom is a symbol for heaven. The kingdom is within you, Jesus said. It's oneness with God. Garden of Eden story, we're oneness with God. We are in oneness with God. God throws us out. And we think we've sinned against God, and so we're scared to death he's going to come hunt us down. Jesus' reframing of that into the story of the prodigal son. We didn't get kicked out. We asked if we could, we left of our own accord. And then we realized we came out into the world, this reality that we create with our interpretive perception grounded in fear, and eventually realized we'd made a huge mistake and said, well, let's go back. Let me see if my father will let me back into the kingdom, probably not as a son, but even if he brings me back as a slave, that would be better than living out here. So he goes back to see if he can get in as a slave, and his father is not the least bit upset with him. His father is not trying to kill him. There is no monster in the closet. His father welcomes him back with open arms. His father was just waiting for him to come back. So, spoiler alert, there is no monster in the closet. Oneness is waiting for you to come back. But you can't see that with spiritual love-based vision until you have removed the fear-based blocks. And removing those blocks is what true spiritual work is about. Not distracting yourself from the blocks, not studying about spirituality so that you have an intellectual understanding of what a block is and various historical schools of thought on how to remove the block. And really, this is kind of a new understanding. So there isn't really a whole lot of historical guidance on this. There are definitely people in the past who have done the real spiritual work and done exactly what I'm talking about, but they didn't necessarily have a vocabulary for explaining it or a way of efficiently doing the work. It was kind of a hit or miss hodgepodge approach. Just, go in a cave and meditate for 50 years. Eventually, you get around to it. Eventually, you just keep meditating, enlightenment happens. And so rebirthing breath work was really good because at least you had an idea of what you were trying to do. It might have taken forever to peel that onion one layer at a time, but at least you were getting somewhere. Every layer peeled was progress. Part of the new understanding is how we can use the body for spiritual work. That goes contrary to the most of the historical understandings of spiritual work, which saw the body as a problem, a cage for the soul to be escaped as soon as possible. But we can use it. It turns out that we can use the body like an instrument for helping us to gauge where we're at in terms of fear and contracted energy versus love and joyously expansive energy. We can use it as a gauge, a thermometer, a barometer to tell us where we are, and then we can use it as a tool to change where we are. So it's kind of like the difference between, having a conceptual understanding about temperature, knowing all about temperature and the difference between temperature and heat, and scientific explanations of atoms and molecules vibrating slower or faster, understanding how a thermometer works and what it's actually measuring and how to read it, yada, yada. When it comes to actually wanting to know how hot is it outside, there's no substitute for having a thermometer that you can read to tell you how hot it is outside. So that was what was given to me with the sacred breath work, was a way of using the felt sense of the body to make spiritual progress. And it was so exciting and it was so radical that I wanted to give it a name, and I came up with embodied enlightenment. And I thought that, I was trying to explain it without having to go on for paragraph after paragraph. And it's like these words came to me: embodied enlightenment. It was like the perfect short little phrase that encapsulated everything about it perfectly. Well, it wasn't long before I found out that everybody and his brother was talking about embodied enlightenment. Not all of them meaning it in this exact same way that I did, but a lot of them. Not all of them breath workers. They would have different approaches. A lot of the non-dual people who could get out of their heads would be talking about embodied enlightenment. A lot of people who talk about spirituality and study academically spirituality and talk about non-duality, they have no idea what embodied enlightenment is all about. I mean, they understand maybe the intellectual concept, but they don't actually do it. So again, it's like intellectually understanding the physics of heat and temperature, but never once going outside with a thermometer to find out how hot it is. But a lot of people talking about embodied enlightenment, and that could be because it's kind of like if you're talking about using the felt sense of the body as a way of working on spiritual progress, that's kind of like the only two words that fit. Or if it's kind of like the best two words you could come up with. It's kind of like the first two words that come to mind. So maybe everybody is just going with the obvious. But, I suspect that it could also be that there is a downloading from the collective Christ consciousness coming into the planet at this time, because with all that is going on in this turbulent world of ours, we need all the help we can get. And this download is bringing to more people, more than just moi, bringing to all of us, bringing to many of us who are in the vanguard of this work, an understanding of how to use the felt sense of the body, like you would use a thermometer as a tool to get a reading and a tool to make changes. And what's really helpful about this new approach is that it works for people who nothing else has ever worked before. People who think they cannot understand the concepts. They can, but they limit themselves with the fear-based interpretive perception and the early childhood conditioning, so they think they can't. The people who emotionally are not ready to face the monster in the closet. It turns out that working with this felt sense of the body's presence works for them. It's like a safer approach. It works even though they don't understand how it works. It is a way they can work with that isn't scary. They're processing emotional trauma that they've spent their whole lives convinced they would never be able to process. And instead of thinking about the past event, which gave rise to the emotional trauma, they're thinking about energy. Is it flowing? Is it stuck? Does it feel good? Does it feel bad? Is it contracted? Is it expanding? And is it warm? Is it cold? And they're just working with energy. And it's completely non-challenging. They don't have to admit they were wrong, which is how they see it when they're dealing with their past traumas in a emotional, interpretive, perceptual approach. If I let this go, it means I was wrong. If I let this go, who will I be then? My whole life, I have been the victim. All of that gets in the way of letting go of the blocks to the awareness of love's presence. But if you work with it, when you learn to use the sacred breath to work with the embodied sense of felt presence, working with the energy is not challenging you or making you wrong or making you bad. It's just energy, and you learn to play with it. And you integrate the energy, and the next thing you know, all that emotional, traumatic stuff, you don't even care about it anymore. It's completely integrated. And you didn't even realize you were doing it. But make no mistake, this is advanced work, and it can be challenging and frightening to some people who are not ready for it. Like I was saying, peeling the onion one layer at a time is as fast as some people can go. It's as fast as some people want to go, are comfortable going, are able to go. And for people like that, I just keep it at the rebirthing breathwork level. And some people aren't even ready for that. I mean, I've had clients making really good progress. Then they come up against the facing the monster in the closet, and they get scared, and they do all kinds of things to get out of their work, to get out of the sessions. I've had clients roll their cars twice and then get sick to get out of sessions. I've had clients trying to turn it into a sexual thing to get out of sessions. I've had clients in the middle of the session run out of the room and run down the street in their bare feet and never come back again. But then I've had clients who are ready and really just ready to do the work because they've seen the futility of trying to heal the human condition in the ordinary way by focusing on the outside. Some people are still trying to make the outside work. They hear, because we live in such a globally interconnected world now. The most unspiritual person can go on the internet and see a YouTube video about breath work and think, oh, that's for me. And really it isn't. But the ones who have realized the futility of trying to deal with dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, with the usual way of cars and new job, new relationship. They come ready for at the very least, the peeling the onion one layer at a time, and they don't run away. They stay and they do, and they're really happy. And then the people who are ready for the advanced approach of chopping down the tree of ego at the root in one fell swoop are really happy with the results of that approach. But even though most of that 11% that are trying the interior path because they figured out the exterior path doesn't work, even though most of them are probably trying to use the interior path the same way they were using exterior things, it's still better, I think, than using the exterior things. It's still a more intelligent approach. And they're closer to the real approach. And eventually they'll probably discover that real approach. If they got this far, they'll probably be guided to get the rest of the way. I mean, nobody goes straight to a PhD, right? You have to go through all the grade levels first. And 10th grade may not be a PhD, but it's more advanced than first grade. And it still has its own intrinsic advantages, good things that it offers as the 10th grade to the person who was at the 10th grade level. Because there's a real sense in which all of the problems of the world today are because most people for thousands of years have been hardcore fear-based ego, first grade. All of our systems, the way the world is run, the economic systems, the political systems, there's very little consciousness in any of it. The workplace, the corporate cubicle. It's all about survival of the fittest, me. It's not that much different from the barbarism of medieval peasants covered in mud, slogging it out with axes, trying to chop each other's heads off. It's barely beyond that, right? And occasionally there would be someone who would realize this is insane, this doesn't work, there's got to be a better way. And they would be few and far between. But now the good news is more and more people are realizing this is insane, this doesn't work, there's got to be a better way. And so they're trying a better way. They're trying going within to spiritual practices. And they're not doing, they're doing the best they can. Let's give them that. But I still think it's better than where we used to be. And I think having like 12% of the population having figured out that this external approach doesn't work and going within, even if they're not particularly skillful at how they go within, it's still an improvement. And it means that around 10% of the population are no longer stuck at first grade hardcore fear-based separation egoic consciousness. So all of that energy is not going into maintaining the systems that have been so destructive to our planet and human beings. So there is a shift in consciousness taking place, which in the first place is the relinquishment of the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, a relinquishment of the egoic consciousness of separation and fear. Which brings about in more and more people a greater awareness of presence, which they then spread to others. Teaching presence, teaching forgiveness, teaching love, maybe not necessarily in the role of a formal teacher, but just by way of example as they go about their everyday lives. And so as they release those blocks, the love's presence begins to arise in them. And, maybe it takes a while to perfectly manifest itself. It's a new skill. We've never, as a species, we've never been at this place before. So it's a new skill, and it may take time for all of us to become fully versed in it. But I think it's I think it will lead us to a better place in our world. If enough of us can get anywhere near the goal in time. Because as we do our ordinary work, with this sense of presence that arises from having freed ourselves, or at least partially freed ourselves, from the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, it's like we create a field that gives other people who come into that field permission to also drop their blocks. For a long time, I thought that I was just supposed to be a teacher of teachers, training people to do breath work, training massage therapists about using breath work to bring a sense of presence into their healing space. You know, you go to see a massage therapist, it's all about muscles and fascia and tendons and thinking about their next 3 appointments and how they're going to get done in time for lunch. That's one kind of experience. You're getting a physical manipulation and your muscles get some healing. You go to a massage therapist who has cultivated presence in their space. So they're not doing anything differently than the other massage therapists, but they are in a sense of aware presence, which gives you permission to enter that sense of aware presence. And the massage is 100 times more effective. Or you go see a licensed clinical social worker, and I've taught them how to cultivate this aware sense of presence. And they've done breath work and shifted into this altered consciousness so they can experience it firsthand. And then they know what it is. And then they can tell when they're in it and they can tell when they're not in it. And they bring that to their counseling sessions with people having all kinds of problematic situations. That aware presence is a healing balm to those people, and they don't do anything differently than any other counselor. They go through the prescribed treatment modality, they do their forms, they check off the boxes, but the client gets so much more out of their time with that person because of the inner work that person has done. So for a long time, I thought I'm going to be working with people like this. I help one body worker, one Reiki person, one therapist, but then they help 30 ordinary people. So now I've improved the lives of nearly 100 people. So like how brilliant is that? How time efficient is that? That's like really. But then I had an occasion of working with a young woman who works for the government, and I thought she was just like, I thought this was going to be a one-on-one type of thing. I'm going to help her. She asked me for my help. She's got a particular kind of a situation going that she doesn't have much time to address. So yeah, this is probably the only thing that's going to get her to where she needs to be as quickly as she needs to be. And I'm helping one person, and that's great. Come to find out, her work for the government was counseling, not like in a therapeutic sense, but helping people who are going through really hard times access government services. So, like the loan officer at the bank isn't a counselor. They don't give you psychotherapeutic counseling, but they can be a jerk or they can be helpful, right? If they're helpful, if they give you counseling that helps you to understand how loans work and what your best approach for getting the loan you need approved would be, I mean, they're like on your side. It's like it can be very helpful, even though they're not technically giving counseling. You just leave feeling uplifted. And this person working for the government here on St. Croix, after we got her through her specific negative and then got her into a greater awareness of presence, when the people that she was helping would come into her field of presence and share in that presence, they would leave from her office uplifted. And that had never happened to them before. So they were like, telling everybody how great she was and filling out their customer satisfaction form with 5 stars. This is the best. And more than just accolades for her and pats on the back from her boss, lots of people left her office uplifted. Their quality of life went up. They human happiness went up. And I thought I was just helping the one person. Turned out I probably had a positive impact on more people due to that one person than all the body workers and energy healers and therapists combined, because government is like, huge numbers of people, huge numbers. But I'm optimistic about what's going on in the world now, because we've got such new powerful tools that anyone can access. This embodied awakening or embodied enlightenment. I actually prefer embodied awakening, but embodied enlightenment is alliterative, so I usually go with that. So instead of seeing the body as an enemy, a cage for the soul to be escaped from, we use the body as a friend. We use it as a tool. It's not real. The body is not real, just like the world is not real. But your consciousness navigates through the interpretive perceptual filters of the body, including the felt sense of the apparent energy flowing through an apparent body, which you can use as a tool. Sometimes I wonder if the ego, in the dawn of philosophical and metaphysical and religious and spiritual explorations of humanity, set it up this whole idea of the body being the enemy, being the cage for the soul that has to be escaped from. I wonder if the ego set that up so we would never look at the body and never realize how helpful it could be as we do our spiritual practices and our spiritual work and our personal growth and self-development work, our inner work. I found it very useful, very helpful, indispensable. Indispensable. It is so powerful. But it's the top of the hour right now. The FCC wants me to say that you're listening to the Children of the Sun radio program on WSTX AM 970 on your radio dial, the soul of the Caribbean, broadcast live every Friday afternoon from 12:30 to 2:30 AST Atlantic Standard Time, because we are located on the beautiful island of St. Croix and the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. It is currently 2 p.m. AST, October 11th, 2024. And we'll take a short break right here at the top of the hour and come back on the other side after everybody's had a chance to attend to business. Back in a flash. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Children of the Sun radio show and podcast, a wide-ranging exploration of positive energy from a fifth dimensional metaphysical point of view.
And we're back. Welcome back. Welcome back to the program. So these I said this process was indispensable, and one of the things that it showed me was that these negative fear-based limiting thoughts that we have, they're not really your thoughts. I was talking about the collective ego of the human condition, and it is constantly thinking negative thoughts. And then as those negative thoughts show up in a particular form, Joe, Mary, Susie, they become specified into some fear-based thought relevant to you and your life situation. But it's like they're being broadcast by the collective ego, and then the individual receivers are picking them up, converting them into a form that is relevant to you. Fear-based thought from the collective ego might show up in Joe as worried about his job. That same fear-based thought broadcast from the collective ego gets received by Mary, and she sees it as being worried about her husband. But it's the same thought based in fear broadcast from the collective ego, so it isn't even really your thought. You just pick it up, convert it into something relevant to you, and then you think it is your thought. And it's designed to get you hooked, to get you upset, to keep you in that contracted fear-based separation consciousness, which is what keeps the whole thing going, this whole world, this whole manifestation. And then it gets reflected in the outer reality of war in the Middle East. Or political stresses here at home. Only the thoughts that you think with love are real, because they're the only ones that come from the kingdom, the oneness. And those are the thoughts that you see with spiritual vision and absolute certain knowledge. So they're not subject to interpretation and aren't changing all the time. They are eternal, which is one of the true qualities of heaven, which is a symbol for consciousness. And as you drop more and more of the blocks and become more and more open to the awareness of love's presence and think more and more with this heavenly consciousness, it cannot help but to be reflected in your outer reality. So your life tends to get much better. But if it's tricky. If you do it in order to get that, giving in order to get never works. First, seek the awareness of God's love, and then all these other things will be added unto you. Don't try to use God like a heavenly shopkeeper. It's going to give you what you want if you play it cleverly. Because really, you don't know what you want. What you really want is oneness. What you really want is to face the monster in the closet, see through it, see it for what it really is, see that it isn't even really there. See that you have not sinned against God, that God is not out to get you, and that God is not seeking revenge against you, that God is ready to welcome you back with open arms into the oneness. So that sense of unsatisfactoriness is healed once and for all. That's what you want. That's what you want. And what I want for all of you is to experience the peace and blessings that come from this awareness. And that's the program for today. Enjoy your weekend. Get out into nature. Get out into nature. It is so healing. Love you all. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend. We are out.